All right, well, good morning. My name is Rob Myers, and I'm with the USDA Sustainable Ag Research and Education, or SARE program, based at University of Missouri. And I'm pleased to welcome you back to the second day of our conference. We've got more great speakers this morning. I'm especially looking forward to Keith Burns talking here in a bit about carbonomics. I've had a chance to hear Keith before, and he does a great job. I've got a couple of announcements before we get started. One is that there's still a few seats on the bus tours, so if you're interested in those, you can pop out to the registration area. They told me they can still arrange a lunch if you want to go on either of those bus tours, so just check out at the registration desk right outside the room. Also, if you're interested in CEU credits, you can also take care of that at the registration desk. So we're going to have a couple of talks here this morning before we get into our breakout sessions following the coffee break this morning. I'm kind of the warm-up act to Keith, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective on some things going on in cover crops related to soil health, and then Keith's going to take a deeper dive into what's happening down in the ground in terms of the underground carbon economy. And as I said, I've had a chance to hear Keith do this talk, and it's a really interesting and fresh way of looking about what happens in the soil. You know, from my own journey with cover crops, like a lot of you, I got exposed to them early on. We had them on our Central Illinois grain farm when I was young, and I can remember my dad when I was a boy in the late 60s pointing to some of our corn and saying, well, look over there, you know, that corn looks better following some of the sweet yellow clover we had a year or two before. And that kind of stuck in my mind as a young boy. And then years later, when I was starting to do research as an agronomist, cover crops were one of the things I started to work with in the early 1990s when I was working on diversification of cropping systems. And I could see the benefits that cover crops were providing, but you know, it wasn't really clear to me what was happening down in the soil. And so part of my journey, like a lot of you, has been to start getting a better handle on what's happening in the soil. And I'm just so excited about all the new discoveries that are occurring with our soil biology. And even yesterday I was learning some new things. And so what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is just share some of the insights that we're gaining from farmers and researchers that are working on soil health as they connect to cover crops. And I've kind of called this the top 10 in terms of some things that we can see with cover crops as they impact soil health. And it really comes back, of course, to what's happening underneath our feet, those things that aren't so easy to see. And it starts, as you've probably heard, with the soil food web and the critters down there being fed. So whether it's a plate of radishes like we have here, or any other type of living biomass and roots that can help feed those organisms, that's critical. You've probably seen a diagram like this with the soil food web from NRCS, where it shows some of the variety of organisms, and of course it's much more diverse than is simplified here. But it starts with bacteria and fungi. We hear so much about that in soil biology. But as I've learned more about it, it's really remarkable how many different types of fungi and how many different types of bacteria are there, and that they're kind of sort of like the plankton in the ocean, feeding all the sea creatures and the whales and so on. They're the kind of the basic of the part of the food chain working with the roots. Keith's going to talk about this exchange of carbon for nutrients, so I don't want to steal his thunder or let him get into that. But there's that whole food chain with protozoa eating bacteria, nematodes eating fungi, other bigger nematodes eating those, and earthworms, insects, arthropods doing their thing to complete that food chain. But the flip side of it is, you know, driving over here from Missouri, like a lot of you, I saw a heck of a lot of fields that looked like this. I think because of the dry fall, we had a lot of people out there doing tillage. And if you think about it, it's kind of like going to the grocery store here in early December and being told, sorry, we don't have any groceries for you till next April. So that's kind of what we're doing to our soil microbes when we don't have anything living out there for that long period of time. So they're either going to go dormant or die without those living roots. Another way to kind of picture this, Jerry Hatfield coined this idea that feeding all the soil organisms beneath the ground in 1 acre is like feeding 2 African elephants. So imagine 2 big elephants on a football field needing to be fed constantly every day, and you get the idea of the amount of biomass that's needed on a daily basis for those soil organisms. Here's another way I've heard some farmers talking about this that I think is really good. You know, can we tap that free solar energy that's falling on our ground for all those months when we don't have a cash crop growing? So if it's corn or soybeans, you know, that may be 7 or 8 months of the year that there's a free resource we could be pulling in and using to build our soil And we're not tapping that very effectively when we have those tilled fields. So one of those organisms we hope to increase because of their benefits is earthworms. And I've told a few people, as I keep reading about earthworms, it's fascinating how much they do for the soil. They are indeed impacted by cover crops, as you probably heard. There's some work in Iowa, along with other places, showing that they increase. On the left, you see the number of middens, which is the mounds that night crawlers will create as they come to the surface. Or on the right, the red circle area shows that just looking at earthworm numbers, a couple different species, that they more than tripled following rye cover crops in 1 year in Iowa. So they do have an impact. If we look at a field like this with cover crops on the left and the tilled area on the right, you can guess which side would tend to support the earthworms better. If we look below the surface, though, it may be less obvious just because we can't see it, that when we have that tilled system, as speakers mentioned yesterday, we're totally destroying all those earthworm channels, the root channels. And what's interesting when you start reading about earthworms is that they're creating a very nutrient-rich area with their castings along those earthworm channels. And so if you think about the roots gravitating to where there's nutrients, of course they're going to follow those earthworm channels. That creates a wonderful growing environment for those roots because of all that nutrient concentration along those earthworm channels. And those are also hot spots of biological activity, again, because of the nutrients in that area and with the roots growing. So I saw this reference that earthworms are soil engineers. I kind of like that phrasing. It helps us think about the fact they're moving organic matter around, helping distribute nutrients, helping cycle material, and so they play a very important role. So just kind of keep that visual in your mind when you think about tilled versus an undisturbed system. I didn't know until a few years ago that there's actually a lot of different types of earthworms. Eileen Kladivko, I see back here, she was one of the first people in this room probably to write a lot about earthworms back in the 90s. And you know, it's amazing, like so many things, there's just all these species that we don't know much about. But the night crawlers are the ones we tend to see on our driveways and sidewalks after a rain or used for fishing. But if you've ever had a composting bin, maybe with some kids, that were using red worms, those are another type of species of worm. There's also the pale or gray worms that tend to tunnel more horizontally. The red worms will stay right at the surface with the leaf litter. And they're all doing things for us, both in terms of cycling organic matter and helping create root channels in the soil. One of those things they're doing, again, is helping with our organic matter. You heard Dan DeSutter talk yesterday here from Indiana. And if you watched his video when we queued that up, one of the things Dan said right at the end of his video was he said, I hope that by the time I finish farming, I've rebuilt my soil organic, my soil carbon to the level it used to be. And when I first heard Dan say that, that really made an impression on me, and I've now heard many other farmers say that. They want to rebuild their soil carbon, restore it to the levels it used to be. You heard, I think David Montgomery mentioned yesterday that we've got about half of the organic matter nationally that we used to have on average. Of course, it varies by field and soil type. And this, of course, has to do with the role of tillage and oxidizing organic matter and erosion and other things that have happened. But the good news is, this comes from Ray Weil's paper, and Ray is talking here about soil organic matter at the conference, that we can rebuild soil organic matter, soil carbon over time if we minimize soil disturbance, and especially if we add cover crops back into the system. And the research shows that the cover crops are the key with that minimal soil disturbance in rebuilding organic matter. Of course, if we add livestock, we can go even faster. So another way to look at organic matter is in terms of just simple bulk density. You know, if you have a lot of bulk density, you've got a brick. If you don't have much bulk density, you've got a sponge. So, you know, which condition would you rather have your soil in? Have that high pore space, ability to absorb water. Of course, the higher organic matter is going to feed those organisms, supply crop nutrients, improve rooting. Just keep in mind with that sponge that we've got half of that sponge capacity that we used to have because we've lost half of that organic matter. So that's part of the goal, is to rebuild this soil organic matter going forward. Well, the organic matter, as I mentioned, relates to nutrients, so that's my point number 4, is that these cover crops really need to be part of our thinking in how we're managing our overall nutrients in the cropping system. Now, probably like some of you, when I got my initial agronomy training, I would say it was kind of the input-output model. you put on a pound of fertilizer to get a bushel of corn. You know, so if you wanted 180 bushels of corn, you put on 180 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. And we still find some people using that rule of thumb. But in reality, that input-output model doesn't reflect the fact that we have complex biocycles going on with the soil organisms. If you look at this even somewhat simplified diagram, there's a lot of different types of bacteria that are playing a role in converting nitrogen between its different forms. You've also got protozoa feeding on those bacteria again. You've got fungi impacting the nutrient balance. One thing I would point out, though, in this diagram is that there is a leakiness in the bottom right part of the picture. And so if we don't have that active soil biology, the system becomes more leaky. We have that nitrogen escaping from the system, going into the groundwater, or going into our tile lines. So that's part of the goal with keeping that soil ecosystem healthy, is to keep that cycling of the nutrients, keeping them in the root zone, and less leakiness. You've heard about cover crops playing the role of scavenging nutrients at the end of the growing season. That's particularly true with nitrogen, but really for any of our nutrients. I will admit, though, and this is a challenge for the researchers in the room, Matt Rourke, where are you? You know, we need to figure out how to understand when those nutrients are released the next growing season. I know Matt has been really looking at this along with some others that are here. And, you know, some of the cover crops that winter kill probably release it very quickly. We know that. Others hold it for a long time, like the cereal rye, maybe even longer than we'd like. But we need to keep researching that, understanding what's going on. The bottom line, though, is these cover crops are helping keep these nutrients in the root zone, keeping them from escaping from where we put them so that we don't lose that economic value. Point number 5, you hear this a lot, keep the soil covered. Sometimes we can think about that just in terms of a simple mulch layer, like you see the rye here between the soybeans, and we heard folks like Dan DeSetter talk yesterday about keeping the soil temperatures cooler. I think Dan had a great analogy, and Jimmy Emmons talked about this too. You know, he doesn't want to be out there working when it's 120 degrees, he wants to be working when it's 70. And I thought that was a good way to phrase it. But we also have more moisture, so between the cooler temperatures and more moisture, that's going to keep more of these soil organisms alive if we have that cover. And it was pointed out that even if you don't have the residue layer, just because of the extra biological activity, that can still help keep the soil a little cooler. I took this photo at Steve Groff's farm. Many of you know Steve. He's here at the conference, one of our speakers. He's done a lot of wonderful field days on cover crops over the years. And Steve, this picture or banner that you had made up really hit me when I saw that a few years ago. The soil is meant to be covered. And I think maybe it was David Montgomery yesterday that said, you know, if you look at a prairie or you look at a forest, you don't see big areas of bare soil. You know, you might see a tiny little patch. But our soil organisms have evolved to have living plants with them year-round. You know, they didn't evolve in these conditions where the soil was bare for the majority of the year. And so no wonder that they don't function very well in that system. Point number 6, related to prairies. Prairies are diverse. We want a more diverse system. That's one of the tenets of soil health's key principles. If we get more above ground biodiversity, we found that creates more below ground biodiversity. So we can do that with a variety of approaches. We can have diverse mixes of covers. Of course, we know farmers are moving in this direction. We've seen with our national cover crop survey that farmers that use cover crops over time tend to add more mixes as they go forward, but also getting more diversity in our rotations. And when we do that, we see better growth of the organisms that we want, like mycorrhizal fungi. Now, we've been hearing a lot about mycorrhizal fungi. I first heard about them in the early 90s when I was doing some work with buckwheat. I thought, the Russians were talking about this mycorrhizal fungi. I thought, what in the heck is mycorrhizal fungi? Well, they are pretty amazing. We're still learning about them, but as Keith will talk about, they're part of this underground carbon exchange. Again, I don't want to steal too much of his information, but we know that in really simple terms, they're creating a larger access to nutrients in the soil with the exchange they're doing with the plant roots. So we created this diagram just to help people visualize you're getting more exploration of the nutrients in that soil root zone by having more of those fungi. Okay, what about rain? We mentioned that cover crops help with organic matter and keeping soil moisture. Most of you have seen a rainfall simulator like this, and you've probably seen it demonstrated where they'll have a sample of the soil that's been tilled like the second group of soil from the left, or pan of soil. And if you look at that bare soil, you can see in front of it there's a lot of water that's run off into the jar. It's also kind of muddy because the soil particles have washed with it. Underneath that bare soil, that jar is kind of empty. If you look right in the middle, you see the cover crop pan, and there's not much water that came off of that one. However, there's a lot underneath it. So obviously the water is infiltrating. And I'd seen that demonstration a couple times. I thought, yeah, that makes sense. But probably like some of you, you've seen this happen when they take those pans and flip them forward. So which one is the tilled soil? It's the one in the front, right? So that's the soil that the water is not infiltrating through, as opposed to the one in the back that's a cover crop, less disturbed soil, where the water is soaking in and infiltrating. And the first time I saw that, maybe 6 years or so ago, I was like, wow, I've been doing tillage as a research agronomist my whole career. I've done a little bit of no-till work. And I never really thought about the fact that the water, the rain, was not soaking into the soil in that tilled system very well. So that really made an impact on me. Okay, number 8, cover crops reduce compaction. We've all either experienced this or seen fields with this. After harvest, we get some muddy tracks out there. And so, of course, the temptation is to grab the tillage equipment to go smooth that out. Hopefully we don't see this situation. And I'll admit, cover crops are not going to fix that problem. But they can help prevent it, and it comes back to the soil microbes. If we can build a stronger soil, maybe we don't get that big tractor bogged down in the first place. So you've heard an ounce of prevention is better than a pound to cure. This is kind of like a microgram of prevention. If we can get those soil microbes growing and providing some of the glue or glomalin that helps bind those soil particles together, and even the hyphae of the fungi will help knit the soil particles together, then we've got a lot more strength. How many times have you heard a no-tiller and cover crop user say, I'm getting in the field earlier than my neighbors because I can get on my soil? You know, it's got that strength that I can drive across it with my equipment. Another way to look at it, which is less expensive? Buying a bigger tractor to pull a deep ripper and burning a lot of diesel fuel, or paying a little bit for some cover crop seed? The research is showing in Ohio, they've got some good work on this. Alan Sundermeyer and some of his colleagues, Jim Horman, have looked at this, that you actually get longer lasting benefits from the cover crop roots than you do from doing the deep ripper, at least on many of our soils. Okay, how about livestock? We heard about this yesterday, that if we can reintegrate livestock, that pays a lot of benefits for soil health. And it's been an interesting trend to me, having grown up on a grain farm where livestock had left when I was a boy, to see some of the grain farmers starting to bring their livestock back and put them out into the fields. And if you think about it, you know, clearly our soils, again, evolved with herbivores. Whether it was the buffalo on the prairies or other herbivores in the woods, those soil organisms are used to having that animal manure and urine and saliva that's stimulating that soil biology. So that's part of the reason we see a more rapid improvement in soil health and soil organic matter if we can add livestock to the system. Now, it's not going to work for everybody. Maybe it's working with a neighbor that has livestock, but something to look at. And the good thing economically is the research is showing that cover crop forage can be very high value. Our forage specialist in Missouri showed that the quality of late season cover crop forage or early spring forage, like from triticale, rye, wheat, and so on, is much higher than from a tall fescue pasture with better rates of gain. So that's one of the reasons we're seeing people move in this direction. Okay, point number 10, cover crops helping with soil erosion. Kind of our old purpose for cover crops. Unfortunately, we still see too much of this happening, big rainfall events moving sediment right out of the field. Here's a field with terraces that's still getting some erosion. And I heard a talk really interesting a couple weeks ago by our NRCS economist in Missouri saying that she found in case studies that cover crops were much more cost effective than just terraces for stopping soil erosion on a per ton basis. So if we can get cover crops out there between the terraces, that'll pay big dividends in areas with moderate to high rainfall. What it comes back to is this whole process. We get that raindrop that's going to detach the soil particle. So can we intercept that with the cover crop leaves if they're living or even dead after the cover crops have been terminated? If we can get the cover crop root channels and earthworm channels to open up and get that rain to soak into the soil, That's a huge impact on erosion because then we don't have as much of the transport event. And of course, those cover crop roots can also help anchor the soil. So some of the work we've done and others have shown that you can reduce erosion by over 90% very easily by adding cover crops to the system. And it's not just water erosion, it's wind erosion. These were some great pictures by a Michigan State extension person. Bruce took these showing a field that had been tilled. On the left, you can see the soil blowing. And on the right, just a little bit of rye starting to grow, but enough to make the difference in holding the soil in place. In fact, in that right photo, in the far back, you can see an adjacent field that had been tilled with the soil blowing. So how does erosion connect to soil health? Yes, we don't want that, but what's the connection? Well, part of it is that our most intense biological activity is in that upper layer of the soil. This is something I just kind of caught on to this past year. I hadn't really thought about that. And so we don't want to lose that very top layer of soil because that's where we've got this concentrated biological activity. That's also where we've got our highest concentration of nutrients and organic matter, unless we're tilling the heck out of the soil, then yes, it would be more mixed up. So if we lose that top inch in a somewhat undisturbed system, we're losing not only biological activity, but a lot of nutrients and organic matter. All right, just to summarize, I like this visual we created as cover crops benefits with the Swiss Army knife, because it shows how versatile cover crops are as a tool for us in our farming system. I can't think of another agronomic management practice that provides as many benefits as cover crops, or potential benefits. And the bottom line for all of these is improving soil health. They all connect back to that in some way. Well, tools are a good thing to have on a farm. Like a lot of you, I enjoy working with tools, and we can build things with tools. And I just ask you to imagine, if we're going to be building things with tools going forward, that we imagine a future where we don't just have an occasional field with cover crops, which is kind of what I saw driving over here from Missouri. This is Rick Jukum's farm with cereal rye. You can see the bright green in northeast Iowa. But where we get to a situation where most of our country has a majority of the acres covered in living covers. And Steve Groff sent me these photos last year in southeast Pennsylvania. He sent me several photos of different parts of that area, and they all look like this. And this is not winter wheat for grain. They only have about 3% winter wheat in that county for grain. So it is possible to get higher levels of covers out there. And in the end, of course, the goal is building soil health. And as we heard some of our speakers yesterday, we're doing this to build the soil health for now and for that next generation to farm and have that productive American soil that helps feed our nation and support our country going forward. So thank you, and I appreciate your attention.